All right. I was down there visiting with the witnesses, and I broke my own rule. I usually like to start right on time, but we're 2 minutes late, so I'll try to make up for it right now. The Subcommittee on Highways and Transit will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee rather, at today's hearing and ask questions without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purposes of an opening statement. We're here today to discuss transportation challenges facing rural areas across the country. Rural communities are the backbone of America. While they're often forgotten about, much of the food and fuel consumed by people across our country is produced in or travels through rural areas to make it to our urban city centers. Without a strong transportation network and updated infrastructure, these vital goods produced by our nation's farmers, ranchers, and manufacturers can't be delivered to market for consumers. The United States Census Bureau estimates around 20% of our nation's population lives in rural areas. While folks living in these communities account for a smaller segment of the overall population, rural areas make up 97% of the total land area in the United States. Our rural communities are essential to the connectivity of the nation, and a robust transportation network of rural highways and roads ensures that people and goods can freely move across the country. These communities vary in shape and size and have vastly different infrastructure needs than their urban counterparts. They also often lack sufficient resources and capacity to make necessary improvements to infrastructure. A report issued in 2022 by the nonprofit research group TRIP found there's a $180 billion backlog in rural road and bridge needs across America. Needless to say, formula funding is critical to states and helps support our rural areas. The states know best what their individual transportation needs are. For example, the transportation needs in my home state of Arkansas vary greatly from the needs of California, Wyoming, or New York. It's paramount we retain the ability of states to prioritize projects and address their wide-ranging needs. That's why the Federal Highway Administration's December 16, 2021 policy memo, which sought to encourage states to prioritize non-motorized modes of transit, as well as updating existing infrastructure over new capacity projects, was so troubling. Thankfully, after a number of us here in Congress raised our significant concerns, Federal Highways did the right thing and superseded their memo. People who live in rural areas often travel further to work, the grocery store, and other essential services. For many, this involves frequently crossing state lines, so there must be some recognition of the implications when one state proposes policies that have implications on interstate commerce. It affects travelers in other communities. It's also unrealistic to think that these communities can or should prioritize bike lanes and pedestrian projects over much-needed critical infrastructure. The same 2022 report by TRIP found that vehicle miles traveled are 50% higher in rural areas than in urban areas. While the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IJA, made changes to existing programs and included initiatives to support rural areas, we heard in a full committee hearing earlier this month about the many challenges that rural communities face in applying for discretionary grants. IJA provided historic funding for the improvement of American infrastructure. The law significantly expanded discretionary grant programs. IJA authorized $196 billion for new and existing DOT competitive grant programs over 5 years. Witnesses raised concerns with the high cost of applying and the lengthy review process that disproportionately affect rural America. Concerns were also shared about the ability of small communities to comply with burdensome federal permitting requirements. These barriers, combined with woke policies the Biden administration has included as part of the Notice of Funding Opportunities for discretionary grants like Justice 40, have seriously undermined the ability of rural communities to compete for grants. The Biden administration has pushed an onerous regulatory agenda that is particularly harmful to rural America. This includes the Federal Highway Administration's final rule to create a greenhouse gas performance measure, forcing state departments of transportation and metropolitan planning organizations to set declining targets for carbon dioxide emissions stemming from transportation on the national highway system. This rule goes beyond the administration's statutory authority. The policy was considered and rejected during Senate negotiations of IJA. Stakeholders have previously testified before the subcommittee that this rule will impact project selections. Furthermore, concerns have been raised regarding how the rule will impact more rural states with communities that can't build a subway or bike lanes to cut emissions. These projects simply don't make sense in communities where the only congestion and traffic jams are caused by combines or cattle. I look forward to hearing today from our witnesses regarding the challenges facing our rural areas, as well as their thoughts on how we might help address issues at the federal level. I now recognize Ranking Member Holmes Norton for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank Subcommittee Chair Rick Crawford for holding this hearing on transportation challenges in rural communities. One of the many benefits of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the surface transportation portion of which I helped to shape as the then chair of this subcommittee, is that it provides funding for communities of all sizes. In my district, the District of Columbia, 151 new transportation projects were started in the first 2 years of the law alone. This includes $72 million to repair the Interstate 395 bridge, $35 million to redesign South Capitol Street, and $20 million for the Wheeler Road Safety Project. But DC's story is not unique. Similar investments are being made in every congressional district in America, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act includes dedicated funding for rural transportation. One example is the Rural Transportation Program. To date, under this program, the Biden administration has awarded funds to 30 different projects to rebuild bridges, eliminate Safeway railway crossings, and increase truck parking. Another example is the RAISE program. 50% of the program funds are dedicated by law to rural areas. The law also increased funding for our safety programs. While only 19% of our U.S. population lives in rural areas, rural roads account for 43% of all traffic fatalities. Reasons for this disproportionate fatality rate include outdated infrastructure and unsafe driver behavior. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act includes 34% funding increase for the primary infrastructure safety program, the Highway Safety Improvement Program, and a 36% increase for programs to prevent unsafe behavior like speeding and drunk driving. The investments will make our roads much safer. We also will hear today about the importance of rural transit. Too often, transit is dismissed as being only relevant for major metropolitan regions like my own. This is simply not true. For an elderly resident who relies on the bus to get to a doctor's appointment, transit is a lifeline. For a person with a disability who is not able to drive, transit is a lifeline. For someone who cannot afford a cow, transit is a lifeline. That holds just as true for rural communities as it does big cities. According to the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Highway Administration, 6.8% of households in rural areas, or approximately 4.3 million people, do not drive a car. I appreciate that we will hear today from Todd Marrow, Executive Director of the Rural Transit System, about the value of transit in rural communities. One of the roles of this committee is to ensure that the nation's infrastructure is safe and efficient in all communities. While my congressional district does not include any rural areas, I appreciate the need to invest in rural America to ensure the safety of roads and bridges, to ensure reliable transit service, and to spur economic development. Those same needs exist for the 81% of the country that live in urban communities. I hope that we are, as a community, working to continue to work together to pass infrastructure investments that improve the lives of all Americans. I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 30 seconds to make an opening comment.
Thank you, Chair Crawford.
Just kidding. You get 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Chair Crawford and Ranking Member Norton, for holding this hearing. Today's hearing focuses on rural transportation and the unique experience, needs, and challenges of rural communities that our infrastructure investments must address. The Census Bureau estimates that 97% of the total land area in the U.S. is in rural areas. Rural communities are not limited to any one part of the country, and certainly not limited to any certain states. The district I represent, which is located north of Seattle, including none of Seattle, is home to rural communities, urban communities, and everything in between. These communities have many shared transportation needs. At the same time, my rural and smaller communities face unique challenges. They play a crucial role in our economy. Many of the first mile supply chains that need infrastructure investment to efficiently get goods and products to market, for instance, are in our rural communities. Rural communities have unique mobility needs. Residents in rural counties are aging. In nearly 85% of counties, more than 20% of the population is 65 or older. Rural communities face distinct safety challenges. While only 19% of the U.S. population lives in rural areas, nearly half of all fatal crashes occur on rural roads. These realities highlight the quality of life, economic development, safety, and mobility benefits we can achieve through investments in rural areas. The bipartisan infrastructure law is helping rural communities respond to these challenges. A frequent topic of this committee is how federal infrastructure dollars can advance equity. A key part of realizing equity in transportation systems is ensuring that smaller communities can succeed in accessing funding. Smaller communities have limited funds to design and apply for infrastructure grants and limited capacity to manage complex permitting and construction. Yet, smaller jurisdictions in my district and throughout the country are in great need of investment. The BIL marked the largest investment in transportation infrastructure since the 50s, and it's already paying off in rural areas. Investing in rural transportation creates jobs while enhancing transportation connectivity, supporting global economic competitiveness of our farmers and manufacturers. A great example of the BIL's investment in rural economies is through bridge funding. Off-system bridges, those not on the federal aid highway system, have had limited access to federal funds. 87% of those bridges are located in rural areas. The BIL takes steps to address this by including a 15% set aside of each state's bridge formula funding for use on off-system bridges. The BIL also created the Bridge Investment Program, which is delivering results in rural America. One example is the $50 million award DOT made to replace and rebuild 6 rural bridges in northwest South Carolina. The Brookings Institute estimates that BIL invests more than $338 billion in specific or significant rural investment opportunities. It includes creating a $2 billion rural surface transportation grant program for safety and connectivity of rural roads, formally establishing the Rural Opportunity to Use Transportation for Economic Success, or ROUTS initiative, to better support smaller communities in accessing federal resources, dedicating half of the $7.5 billion for the RAISE grant program to rural areas, and establishing new set-asides and highway formula programs to direct more federal funding to rural roads and bridges. Another issue I've heard from my constituents and community leaders about is increasing mobility in rural areas. Transit is often associated with larger cities, but it is also very important for rural and smaller communities. Transit riders don't care about whether the system is classified as rural, small urban, or large urban. They do not care if they are one of the 380,000 annual riders on Island Transit in my district, or one of the 2.5 billion annual riders on New York's Metropolitan Transit Authority. What they do care about is getting to their jobs on time, making it to doctor's appointments, or being able to visit friends or family. That's why the BIL made significant investments in transit infrastructure nationwide, including $4.6 billion for rural area transit formula program, a 42% increase over the prior authorization. The BIL also invests $1 billion to support ferry service to rural areas, mainly Alaska, I'd note. The BIL also requires that 15% of all bus and bus facility grants go to transit investments in rural areas. And in my district, Island Transit was awarded $7.5 million in a grant to design and construct the South Whidbey Island Transit Center. I don't want to steal Todd Morrow's testimony too much, but this project is going to create jobs and make travel easier for residents of Whidbey Island. Additionally, transit agencies in Skagit and Whatcom counties in my district received almost $15 million from the FTA to upgrade their bus systems. While these agencies serve small urban areas, they actually do provide quite a bit of vital service connecting surrounding rural communities. So I welcome this opportunity to discuss the challenges facing rural communities and highlighting the ways that BIL is already working to address the problems. I also appreciate hearing what programs and funding we may consider in the upcoming surface authorization to ensure that every community, no matter the size or location, shares in the benefits of infrastructure investment. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I look forward to today's discussion. I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now I want to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Before we have the formal introductions, I want to briefly acquaint you with our lighting system. As you can imagine, it's pretty self-explanatory. Green, yellow, red. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, but unlike a stoplight, yellow does not mean proceed with caution as you might expect. It means step on the gas because it's fixing to turn red. Once it turns red, you might hear a little tap, 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 just to remind you that your time has expired. So I just want to make sure everybody was clear on that and how that lighting system works. I ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. See the lighting system. Before our first witness, Mr. Coles, gives his testimony, I'd like to recognize Representative Van Orden to give a short introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Transportation infrastructure. Kidding me? What's going on here?
That's a comms problem, Senior.
Very well. Dang, Army guys in charge. Hey, it's great to have another Wisconsinite here. I appreciate you showing up. There's 2 of us now, so we've got everybody surrounded. Mr. Marco Colas from Shawano, Wisconsin, has dedicated his working life to finding solutions to everyday transportation infrastructure challenges we experience in America's dairyland. After receiving his bachelor's degree in political science, the one strike against him from Wartburg College, and his master's in urban and regional planning from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Mr. Colas has spent 26 years committing to improving Wisconsin's transportation system, specifically for our rural roads. He currently serves as the executive director of Wisconsin Towns Association, where he and his team work with state elected officials to improve transportation, land use, emergency services, housing, economic development conditions, and for communities across the state. He also served as the president of the National Association of Towns and Townships from 2020 to 2022, which he collected with the state and federal governments to fund our, collaborated with the state and federal governments to fund our local and minor collector roads. Thank you, Mr. Colas, for coming. I appreciate you being here today, and I understand that you brought cheese for the entire subcommittee, and we appreciate that greatly. I'm looking forward to hearing your testimony.
Office, right?
And with that, Mr. Coles, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Norton, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the challenges facing rural roads. I am Mike Colas, the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Towns Association. We represent 1,266 rural municipalities that range in size from a couple of hundred miles to 100 square miles. 58% of them are home to less than 1,000 people. 90% of those municipalities are home to less than 2,500 people, so really rural. I was recently, as Representative Van Orden noted, president of the National Association of Towns and Townships. We represent 10,000 plus of those rural communities. In the most recent census, as has been noted twice, 19% of the population lives in rural areas. The amount of land that covers, though, is 97%, and maybe even more striking for this committee, 68% of the road miles are in that rural area. In the United States, our interstate system is really the heart of our system. The veins and the arteries, those are the state highways. And then those local roads, which are a vast majority of the entire system, those are our capillaries. In America's dairyland, and I don't have cheese for everybody, but in America's dairyland, we have a saying, milk does not come from the grocery store. It comes from a farm that is on one of those capillaries. We produce a lot of forest products in Wisconsin. The lumber and also the concrete that we produce helps build buildings in cities and rural areas alike. That comes off a capillary. And I'm sure you're all big Packer fans. You know Green Bay, best team out there, of course. Green Bay is also known as the toilet paper capital of the world. That pulp comes from aspen trees that comes off of a capillary that gets that wood to the Green Bay to turn into toilet paper. So ingest a little bit. Without rural roads, you don't have toilet paper, folks. An athlete cannot succeed if they have a strong heart and weak capillaries. I'm telling you, the rural areas in our system have those capillaries, and they are weak. We have a sickness, and that hinders our economy, and that hinders our safety, as was noted by several members. Just a couple of facts. In 2020, 48% of the nation's arterials and collectors were rated in poor, mediocre, or fair condition. These arterials and collectors represent only 31% of the rural roads. 67% of the rural roads are actually functionally classified as local. So again, a major part of the system. A national condition rating for those most local roads is hard to determine, but in Wisconsin, I can tell you that 11% are in poor condition, and 76% need some type of maintenance or construction work. As for bridges, story's sort of the same. We have 42,000 bridges in this country that are rated as poor or structurally deficient. 80% of them are rural. Interestingly, and not a lot of folks understand this, a bridge is defined as anything over 20 feet. We have a lot of structures that are called culverts, under 20 feet, that act a lot like bridges. And yet, on the local system in this country, we don't know where they are, we don't know how many there are, and we have no idea what the safety condition is on them. And about 10 months ago, we had one in Representative Van Orden's district, a 15-foot culvert that collapsed under the weight of a 20-ton fertilizer tender. Nobody got hurt, thankfully. When they deconstructed the culvert, the engineer said the newest it was 1916, so it was built earlier than 1916. I'll note one final fact. It's been noted already. Rural roads are significantly more dangerous. The fatality rate on rural non-interstates is double what it is on others. I put a lot of solutions in my written materials. I've included 3 here that I'll note. First, we need to make sure that the money gets down to the local level. Right now, we have some wonky definitions. 200,000 is considered rural, and I can tell you that NATAT does not think that 200,000 people is rural. We need stable, consistent funding. The FAST Act and IIJA are necessary investments. We need to make that stable and growing so that we can plan better, so that contractors can plan better, so that material suppliers can plan better. And third, we have to be proactive. The culvert crisis is one example of where we can either wait for the crisis to happen or get out ahead of it. Thank you.
Thank you, and I now recognize our ranking member for the introduction of our next. I'm sorry. We're gonna jump to Mr. Gradaman. You're recognized for 5 minutes. My apologies.
No problem. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Norton, and members of the committee. My name is Jeff Gradaman. I'm the president of Windstar Lines, a family-owned charter bus company based out of Carroll, Iowa. I appreciate the opportunity to testify about rural transportation challenges and the importance of bus operations in meeting the public transportation needs of rural communities. The timing of this hearing is important as private bus operators are facing increased challenges to provide these vital services. The goal for the transportation policymakers is to support a connected, nationwide transportation service for the public. Private bus operators, both charter operators like Windstar and scheduled service operators, play a critical role in this system, ensuring rural communities have access to vital services, educational and job opportunities, and connections to the broader national transportation network in a safe, cost-effective, and environmentally friendly manner. However, the operating environment for bus operators is deteriorating rapidly, and the COVID pandemic took a toll. Bus operators are increasingly losing access to key facilities which provide intermodal connections, and many of these facilities are publicly funded. Also, we're seeing jurisdictions restricting access through zoning or other means to prevent rural operators from establishing safe pickup and drop-off points that provide meaningful connections to other services. There is statutory language to prevent these restrictions, but these entities are finding ways around it. Recognizing inner-city bus service provides an essential link between rural communities and the rest of the nation, the federal government created the 5311F program because major inner-city bus carriers were forced to abandon less productive routes. But the program has not kept up with today's costs and business environment, putting bus operators who participate in the program at increased risk of abandoning these routes or face going out of business. These issues put a strain on rural operators. As well, there are basic infrastructure needs in rural states. Congestion and potholes are not solely the problem of large urban areas, and rural states need the flexibility to choose the infrastructure investments that best fit their needs. For this reason, Mr. Chairman, we support your legislation addressing the recent federal highway rule that could limit a state's ability to make infrastructure investment decisions, such as adding capacity when appropriate. Just one example is completing the 4-laning of Highway 30, which runs through my hometown in Iowa. Highway 30 is the most heavily trafficked route outside of Interstate 80. Limiting our state's ability to determine when Highway 30 gets its last miles 4-laned is unneeded federal oversight and should be left in the hands of local and state officials. We are also challenged by resource issues. As you've likely heard, we face staffing shortages. Finding qualified drivers is one of the biggest challenges to bus operators today, and in rural areas this is more difficult due to lack of CDL testing sites and the time it takes to obtain a CDL. Additionally, there are a number of broader challenges we face that are not just limited to rural operators, but pose a threat to the entire private bus industry. Bus operators and CMV operators in general engaging in interstate operations are wholly dependent on a national uniform safety scheme. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations work, and they work because the operators can cross state lines without the risk of running into differing individual state rules and regulations. Because of this uniformity, national safety standards remain in place and all operators play by the same rules. For this reason, we oppose any effort by the FMCSA to waive its preemption of state rules concerning drivers' hours of service. Windstar operates in the lower 48 states, and the burden to keep up with 48 different hours of service schemes would be overwhelming. We can't operate with a patchwork of hours of service regulations. We need a national standard. Finally, the bus industry has a long and successful environmental track record taking cars off the road and relieving congestion. We are proud of these efforts and support addressing climate change issues. However, recent policy initiatives and regulations to push CMV owners towards ZEV technology, although well-intended, are unrealistic for the bus industry. Please understand, we are not opposed to cleaner vehicles, but the transition requires a more reasonable timeline with realistic expectations for our industry. For bus operations, technology is still under development. Appropriate charging infrastructure is not yet in place. The cost to transition to ZEVs is also significant, particularly for an industry dominated by private small business. Right now, the cost of an electric bus is twice the cost of a diesel bus, and the price is even higher for hydrogen. And the cost for the infrastructure, coordinating with power suppliers, and training for staff to maintain the fleet. Also, current EVs on the market can't meet the capacity, range of diesel vehicles. We have no idea on the resale value. Investment of this sort is very risky for small businesses, and especially for rural operators already struggling to remain in operation. Robust funding is available for transit and school bus industries, but once again, the private bus industry is being left out. We want to be supportive, however, we need more reasonable timelines and resources. I will close by saying if rural bus services are to survive long-term, there needs to be greater recognition of the critical role we play in the national transportation network and the very real challenges we are facing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir. And now recognize the ranking member for an introduction of our next panelist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Todd Morrow, the Executive Director for Island Transit, which provides safe, reliable, and accessible transportation services for more than 380,000 riders in Island County, Washington State each year. Todd's a seasoned leader in the transit industry with 23 years of experience, and I knew him before then as well. Throughout his career, he's worked to promote public transportation at the local, state, and federal level. In his role as Island Transit's Executive Director, Todd has helped the agency weather the pandemic, and he has secured funding for capital projects that will improve service for community members on the island. He's guided the agency through the interagency process by moving towards a zero-emission fleet, as well as implementing sustainable energy practices. He's also focused on increasing Island Transit's service, adding Sunday service for the first time in the agency's history. Morrow's leadership extends to various industry roles as well, including past presidency of the Washington State Transportation Association's Board of Directors, and he continues to be an integral part of the Bus Coalition, serving as the treasurer. I want to thank him for making the trip out and look forward to hearing his testimony. Thank you. Thanks, Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Morrow. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Chair Crawford, Ranking Member Larson, and committee members, thank you for this opportunity to discuss rural transit. I am Todd Morrow, Executive Director of Island Transit. I'm here representing the 1,200 members of CTAA, otherwise known as the Community Transportation Association of America, the majority of which are rural public transit systems. My public transit agency serves Island County, a rural county of 86,000 northwest of Seattle. Island County has the most visited state park in Washington and is the home of the Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. As a rural transit agency, we receive our federal funding through our state Department of Transportation. Island Transit has a $21 million annual budget, 63 buses, 136 employees, 16 bus routes, and an operating base on each of our 2 islands. We provide traditional, on-demand, paratransit, and van pool service. We carry approximately 7,500 passenger trips an average week. 13% of those are ADA paratransit trips for those receiving door-to-door service. Popular destinations include grocery stores, local hospital, Walmart, restaurants, schools, and the Washington State Ferry for Boeing and Microsoft workers. Just as in urban areas, people need access to those places. This is especially true for vulnerable Americans, older adults, persons with disabilities, and low-income individuals. Everything we do is about safely and equitably moving people. We are currently growing our service. Last June, we began bus service on Sundays for the first time. We are unique because we are zero fare. Our agency receives 70% of our operating revenue from voter-approved, locally collected sales tax. The recent increases in federal transit funding are making it possible for Island Transit to move 2 critical projects forward. One is our South Whidbey Transit Center project, which will create a safe place for off-street transfers. The Federal Transportation Administration awarded it $7.5 million. Like urban systems, rural systems need modern facilities. Competitive bus and bus facilities funding makes that possible. One challenge that occurs with facility building is transit, unlike highway projects, is required to complete the environmental process prior to purchasing the property. Our other major project is transitioning our fleet to zero-emission vehicles. We have 7 battery electric vehicles in our fleet already, solar panels on our 2 operating bases, and battery charging at our main operating base. Another challenge is the availability of vehicles. Our agency's current purchase of 9 more electric vans is in limbo because manufacturers have gone out of business. Vehicle prices, particularly for these small vehicles that rural systems depend on, have dramatically increased. This shortage also impacts large buses, particularly hydrogen fuel cell buses. There's just one Buy America compliant manufacturer of hydrogen buses. This year, we will be requesting federal funding to purchase 12 of those full-size hydrogen buses. Both Island Transit and CTAA support the Federal Transit Administration's recent prioritization of progress payments to bus manufacturers to help them with their cash flow challenges. We welcome strategies to increase access to new bus manufacturers while they become Buy America compliant. For rural systems, the fleet transition is challenging because advances in zero-emission technology have not successfully reached the smaller class of vehicles we use. Their battery range is low. Charging infrastructure, too, is just not as prevalent yet in rural America. The capacity of our local power grid and grid resiliency is also a concern. To address this, my agency has purchased acreage adjacent to our operating base, with the potential for siting a microgrid there for possible additional electricity. Recruitment is challenging for transit agencies as well. We see 2 places where the federal government could help us. One is to fast-track the certification of oral testing labs for our required drug and alcohol testing. CTAA requests members of this committee send a letter to HSS to urge them to finish this important work. Another area is the requirement for a commercial driver's license. We need an addition to the CDL passenger endorsement that is focused on bus driving and public transit. I'd like to end by introducing you to one of Island Transit's bus riders, James, a veteran turned veterans advocate. He said, "Island Transit gives people like me, a vet, a chance to go where I need to go and help others. Without Island Transit, I couldn't do what I do. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak to you today.
Thank you. Now recognize the gentleman from South Dakota to introduce our final witness.
Mr. Chairman, on one hand, it's sufficient to describe my friend Scott as a third-generation producer from Volga. That's important and noble work, so it's a good description. But on the other hand, it doesn't tell the whole story. The reality is Scott is among the very most trusted policy voices in South Dakota. And as I thought about why that is, it's because so many people in politics, they're dramatic and they're hyperbolic and their hair is always on fire. In typical Farm Bureau fashion, though, Scott Vanderwall is level, steady, deliberate, and wise. And so people in South Dakota have figured out that when Scott Vanderwall tells you something, you can take it to the bank. And I'm sure that will be the experience of this committee as well today. Thank you for being with us.
Thank the gentleman from South Dakota. And Mr. Vanderwall, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Good morning. I am Scott Vanderwall, a third-generation corn and soybean farmer and cattle feeder from East Central South Dakota. I'm president of the South Dakota Farm Bureau and vice president of American Farm Bureau Federation. And I'm pleased to offer this testimony today on behalf of the American Farm Bureau Federation and the nearly 6 million Farm Bureau member families across the United States. The long-term success of American agriculture relies upon a robust, safe, and dependable transportation network. My testimony today will outline several key issues affecting our nation's agriculture industry and transportation infrastructure. During the past few years, farmers in South Dakota have been under pressure from a variety of factors outside of our control, such as the pandemic, 3 consecutive years of drought, and the highly pathogenic avian influenza. Farmers were more frustrated than anyone at the supply chain delays we saw during the pandemic. We want the supply chains straightened out as soon as possible so we can get goods from our farms to America's pantries. That's why I'm grateful that Representative Johnson from South Dakota has introduced the Modernizing Operations for Vehicles and Emergencies Act, or the MOVE Act. This bill gives states more flexibility to waive federal weight limits in this interstate highway system in order to allow the states to respond to emergencies. This will help to resolve supply chain issues quickly and allow our food system to be more adaptable. The American Farm Bureau Federation continues to be supportive of the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, or EJA, that made essential investments to our nation's infrastructure. These investments will continue to give farmers and ranchers a leg up on competitors in the world market. This last year, the U.S. became a net importer of food for the first time in many of our lifetimes. So new investments are timely. This is a huge concern for us as we work very hard every day to make sure that the United States is not dependent upon other countries for our food supply. Food security is a huge part of national security, and we take that very, very seriously. Farmers and ranchers do not work remotely, but our products reach markets well beyond our farm gates. Nearly everything we do involves physical items, whether it's crop inputs, feed, livestock, grains, or other produce that we grow. These all have to be moved physically from or to markets around the world or the United States. While highways play a vital role in transporting goods across the country, we must also recognize the importance of our rail and inland waterway infrastructure. In most cases, transporting goods via waterways can be more cost-effective than traditional road transport. The National Highway Trust Fund serves as the backbone of our transportation infrastructure, providing crucial funding for maintenance and improvement of our roads and bridges. Farm Bureau supports increasing Federal Highway Trust Fund fees to reflect improvements in fuel economy and increased inflation. We also support revenue collection efforts to those users whose vehicles do not contribute to the Federal Highway Fund, such as electric vehicles. I'm hopeful that this committee will work with the American Farm Bureau Federation to prioritize long-term, sustainable funding solutions for the National Highway Trust Fund. Electronic logging devices, or ELDs, play a crucial role in ensuring the safety and efficiency of our nation's transportation system. However, certain exemptions of these devices are necessary to accommodate the unique needs of the agricultural community. We aren't hauling widgets that can sit in a truck bed for 10 hours. We're hauling live animals, and each stop along the way poses hazards to the livestock. The EJA provided an exemption for livestock and insect haulers from hours of service regulations within a 150-mile air radius of their final destination. We are thankful that Congress continues to recognize that need, and we ask for continued support on that. In conclusion, I urge this committee to consider the perspectives and priorities of the agricultural community as you work to address the challenges that face our nation's transportation infrastructure. By working together to prioritize long-term investment, maintain necessary exemptions, and promote biofuel production, we can ensure a brighter, more sustainable future. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. I thank all the witnesses for being here today. Thank you for your testimony. Now turn to member questions. I recognize myself. I'd like to raise an issue that I have significant concerns with, which is the Federal Highway Administration's final rule to create a greenhouse gas performance measure, forcing state departments of transportation and metropolitan planning organizations to set declining targets for carbon dioxide emissions stemming from transportation on the national highway system. This policy was considered and rejected as part of negotiations of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Despite that fact, the Biden administration continues to march forward with their proposal. The full committee and this subcommittee have previously heard concerns from other stakeholders regarding this rule. Specifically, folks have raised concerns about how this rule will impact the ability of states to select their own projects and what that would mean to rural communities. As I mentioned in my opening statement, these are areas where a subway system or bike lanes just simply don't make sense, and they won't help move people or goods within or from our rural areas. So I'd like to start with Mr. Gredeman. Do you share those concerns?
Yes, great question, Chairman. Absolutely. You know, because the greenhouse gas performance measures apply a one-size-fits-all to both rural and urban communities, it just doesn't make sense for certain communities to have bike lanes, to have subways, to have heavy transit in rural Iowa, rural Arkansas, western Nebraska. These places don't need that type of service. And when you start influencing state officials on how they can spend their revenue, it leads to me, it just seems like a recipe for disaster. And reducing greenhouse gas is important, but it needs to be done in a fiscally sensible way. They'll end up spending money on projects that are not necessary and don't provide any economic benefit. And no, I don't think it benefits rural America at all.
Thank you. Mr. Vanderwall, you addressed this in your written testimony. You want to expand on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, we are very concerned about that process because it does complicate the process. For a small state like South Dakota, we don't have the resources in a lot of cases, and frankly, not the need for some of these transportation methods. Like you mentioned, subways. We don't have any subways in South Dakota. Electric vehicles is another one that's a real challenge for us because it can be 25 degrees below zero in the wintertime. And as we saw with the Chicago during the cold snap this winter, they don't work well in that circumstance. So we believe it's not fair to states that have fewer resources, and we need flexibility among the states. Like the previous speaker said, one size doesn't fit all.
Got it. Mr. Gredeman, in your testimony, you discussed the importance of having one federal standard for companies engaged in interstate commerce as it relates to meal and rest break provisions. Can you elaborate on that and why there's currently a patchwork of state provisions and how that's problematic?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, one aspect of our company's mission is maintaining operational simplicity. And not only would this create operational inefficiencies for our company, it creates operational inefficiencies for every single company that operates in interstate commerce. How would the DOT hours of service rules apply? Which state regulations would supersede? You know, we have motor coaches that depart Sioux Falls, South Dakota, pick up a group in northwest Iowa. The driver from South Dakota switch drivers in Illinois or Missouri by St. Louis, switch to another driver, which sets of rules would apply? We're going to drive through 6 states. We're going to use drivers from multiple states. We have an origin, we have a destination. Which state rules will apply? You know, cross-country travel will be completely disrupted. How will electronic logging devices accommodate the different state changes? Right now, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, they work. We have a uniform safety scheme that works great for the United States travel, and having a patchwork of different state provisions would just be an utter failure in progress of moving goods, services, and people across the United States.
Thank you. The Clean Freight Coalition just this week announced the results of a study which found $1 trillion in investments could be required to meet goals set by states and federal government to reduce emissions from and electrify the trucking sector. Mr. Vanderwall, our ag sector, like many others, relies on trucking to deliver goods to market. American families are dependent on those products. I have some concerns about forcing a massive shift to EVs, and particularly as it applies to trucks. A trucker hauling cattle across Arkansas doesn't have the hours to spend waiting for their truck to charge. Your thoughts on that in just a few seconds?
Yes, we would be concerned about that. We feel that if the administration wants to reduce the carbon footprint, we certainly have something to contribute through biofuels and renewable fuels that we can contribute. You're correct. We can't have livestock trucks sitting along the side of the road, especially in hot conditions. So it's very, very much a concern for us.
Thank you, appreciate that. Ranking Member Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a question for Mr. Coles. Can you share your concerns about the bill and the effects that allowing heavier trucks would have on safety and infrastructure, particularly on bridges?
We work closely with the Farm Bureau in our state, and we're going to take just a little bit different position than the Farm Bureau during this hearing. So NATAT is opposed to extra weights on the roads. From an engineering aspect, it creates more damage, especially to bridges. Bridges don't care about axles, it's all about weight. And then from a safety standpoint, for the few states that we do have enough quality data from, the safety aspects are problematic as well because the crash amounts increase. So we're very concerned about any increased weights beyond the current standards that are there right now.
Thank you. Mr. Morrow, your testimony notes that over 15% of people in Island County have a disability. Transit is often a lifeline for people with disabilities. Can you share any strategies or success stories from Island Transit's work serving those in your community with disabilities?
Well, thank you very much, Ranking Member Holmes Norton. Appreciate the question. And yes, as you know, transit is critical to supporting access to opportunities for all Americans, especially those who are dependent on it, and that includes people with disabilities. And one of the things that we've done in order to make more access to opportunities available is increase our service and add service. As you heard, we added Sunday service for the first time in our history, which means that now people who are transit dependent or with disabilities and use us can now access and do whatever they want on Sundays where our service goes. And one really interesting story about that was a gentleman named Lucas, one of our bus riders, a wonderful young man, who was obviously thrilled that we would add Sunday service because it opened up opportunities for him. He organizes his life around our bus service so that he can see his friends and go to work and do all those things. When he met me the first week after I was at Island Transit, he saw me standing at the bus stop looking like I am today, and I think he was pretty suspicious, who's this guy getting on there, and he knew right away I was the new executive director. And he treated me like the President of the United States because what Island Transit does for him on a daily basis so very much improves his life. Thank you.
Mr. Morrow, what can Congress do to help ensure transit agencies can purchase the vehicles they need?
Well, thank you for that question. You're already doing it with the investments, for instance, the strong and increased investments in the bus and bus facilities program has made a substantial difference. Obviously, a bus operator like myself will say there's always room to do more. I think you all know that there was maybe $8 billion in requests in the last round for bus and bus facilities funding, and available was about 1.7 billion, something like that. My agency benefited from that, and I thank Ranking Member Larson for that, for the FTA grant that we received. But also supporting things like the progress payments that the FTA is working on that will help manufacturers so that they can receive payment for the vehicles as they're produced. That will help them. Investing in technology. One of the real challenges in the rural transit industry for us in the CTA world is that not all of those improvements have made it to the small bus market yet. And so we really need to see longer battery ranges, other options in the small vehicle market. And then, as I mentioned before, and this is, I know, something that some of you are working on, is an on-ramp for the manufacturers who are in the process of coming to the United States, who have good vehicles that we could use today. We need somehow to have access to those vehicles while they're working through the Buy America process. It's all those sorts of things in combination. And then also remember, it's different depending on whether small vehicles and large vehicles. There's no one-size-fits-all response. Thank you.
And I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. Gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vanderwall, ag shippers have dealt with a lot in recent years, high path, drought, COVID. Talk to us about the difficulties they've faced when dealing with those challenges and the emergency truck weight waivers.
Well, thank you, Representative, for that question. That's a big deal for South Dakota and frankly, most of the states. And I guess I would use an example of the Texas drought about 3 years ago. South Dakota was having a good year. We had lots of hay, and we had lots of ranchers wanting to donate hay to the ranchers in Texas. And logistically, it got to be a problem because they had to get exemptions from governors across all the states, all the way from South Dakota to Texas, and that got to be quite a process. But what the situation is you want to do something like that as economically inexpensively as you can. And when you have people donating hay, and in some cases we had people donating their at least some of the truck miles, the trip permits and all the things that go along with going through those states and the different regulations get to be a problem. So our members put in policy a request to streamline the process to make that happen more economically.
Yeah, and you can just imagine all kinds of scenarios, emergency scenarios where some additional flexibility and streamlining that flexibility could be useful. Give us some other ideas, examples of where ag shippers, or really the ag industry generally, would want a little more flexibility.
Well, I would start out by answering that by saying livestock can't wait for feed in disaster situations. We've had it in South Dakota too, floods, snowstorms, all kinds of things. We've had several cases in the past where the governor has waived the height and weight limits for trucks hauling hay certain times of the day or extended the hours. Those are all times when livestock in particular need taken care of, and they can't wait, like I said.
So as we look to, there's a 150-mile exemption for ag truck drivers. They can get around the hours of service, or the hours of service don't apply to them. In general, is that working pretty well? Are there any reforms needed to the system?
Yes, it certainly has helped because it gives them some flexibility. And flexibility is what we really need. When we talk about this whole situation, that's really the key. And I'll use an example of trucks that go out to western South Dakota or Montana to pick up feeder cattle. A lot of times they have to go out in the pastures, and the rancher will often have them rounded up in the corrals, and sometimes they don't. So the trucker can arrive, and it might take 20 minutes to load the load, or it could take 2 hours. And at that point, they might know that they're going to be out of hours before they get where they're going. And a concern that we would have there is if that happens, a rancher may not be able to sell his cattle that have to go that far away. And maybe that's the best bidder for his cattle, but he could be prevented from selling for the best price in that circumstance.
Yeah, not everybody might understand how much more difficult cattle can be to wrangle than a pallet of iPhones. They have their own minds, and they don't always take orders very well, as you know better than I do. Let's talk a little bit about the global supply chain and shipping. During COVID, the West Coast ports were pretty locked up for quite a little while. That had a pretty big impact on beans, which I know, along with corn and cattle, you produce. And then also with the Red Sea. I mean, is Farm Bureau concerned about, and have we seen much disruption, particularly the corn and bean folks, because of the Red Sea issue?
Yes, we have seen some disruptions, and obviously we're in a worldwide economy when it comes to corn and beans and a lot of these commodities. And it affects the markets because the markets get jittery about certain things like that. They don't like uncertainty. They don't like disruptions. And whether or not the products that we raise in South Dakota are going someplace where they have to go through the Black Sea, that doesn't really matter, but it's the disruptions in the market. And so we try to look for other markets or expanded markets around the world, but at this point, we haven't been able to do that either. So it is a problem, and we're concerned about it going forward.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would close by just trying to underline a couple of things that Mr. Vanderwall talked about, things that we can take back into our work. Number one, some additional flexibility for America's growers. I mean, our farmers and ranchers, they'll do better if they have the flexibility they need to get these products, get this food to market. And then also the importance of developing new markets abroad. In America, we ship out a heck of a lot of corn, beans, beef, vegetables, dairy, and other things. People are hungry for our food. Let's make it easier for them to get it. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Ranking Member Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Morrow, Todd, thanks for coming, helping us out on short notice. Appreciate that. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about Island County or Island Transit Service. I think it might have been kind of glossed over quickly. Island Transit, by its virtue of its name, it's an island. In fact, it's two islands, not just one island. It's two separate islands, unconnected by a bridge. You have to go around into other counties to get to the other island. So you have some unique challenges, but you're trying to update service, expand service, extend hours, and of course you move to Sunday. From a rural transit perspective, what are the challenges you're facing doing that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Congressman. One of the main challenges right now, and I think it exists in pretty much every industry, of course, is having the workforce available to do the things that are needed. In our case, we just started another class of driver trainees. That's great, but we still need more. And in order to complete our transition, as that you alluded to what we call Island Transit Maximized, to expand service, to really meet all the needs throughout the day, we need to add a couple of hours to the end of the day. And that's the last thing that we need to do. And it's going to take us probably about 7 to 10 more drivers in order to do that. So it's going to be several months off. We had hoped to do it last year. So that is always challenging. Operating costs are definitely always higher in rural environments, and that's something that all of us that provide transit across America, and particularly rural situations, know. But just because we're in a rural environment doesn't mean that those people deserve any less the services that all Americans enjoy.
So on extending hours to the end of the day, why is that so important?
Well, we have essential workers, for instance, that rely on transit because their transportation costs are so high. Transit allows them to save money, and these are the people that work, for instance, at Walmart, one of our busiest commercial entities on the island that serves the people that are there. Their hours are till 11 o'clock at night, and so those workers that work those shifts are not currently able to use us because we don't have those hours. That's what our goal is, to add those hours so that we can support those workers.
And then do you have specific service? You mentioned Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, which is I should note, the home of half of the P-8 fleet and all of the Growler fleet, the electronic attack aircraft. So you're welcome, America. Do you have any specific service for NAS Woodby Island?
Yes, thank you for asking. We actually have on-demand direct service where individuals who are properly credentialed, including servicemen and women, as well as civilians that are there, we take them from their neighborhoods directly on base. And the wonderful thing about it is it avoids the congestion at the gate and leading up to the gate, and it saves them money. Many of them are a single-car household, and so this frees up the car to be used by the spouse that's not working there.
You mentioned a challenge, or maybe you didn't see it as a challenge, but the service you provide for folks who are disabled or homebound or otherwise, about 13% of your
Correct.
ridership, is that right?
Yep, exactly. Yep. 13% of our service is paratransit service. Obviously, that's expensive because you're providing a door-to-door service. So what we try to do is batch together as many trips as possible. There's software that we use. This is something rural transportation providers have been doing forever, is figuring out ways to efficiently transport people where they need to go. But it is more expensive. We've combined it now with our on-demand service in other areas so that we can do all of those things together more efficiently.
Can you, how does that compare to, say, your neighboring transit agencies?
Well, on-demand service is something that's starting to be seen more and more across the country. We've just started it. There are some that still do not have it. And then if you're getting to the point of how do we connect up with other systems, we have arrangements and we do connect both our paratransit and our fixed route scheduled service so that people can make those connections. However, if you're a veteran and you need to go to Veteran Affairs or medical services, that can be harder in a rural area like ours because there are no direct bus routes off the island to take people. So there are actually social service agencies that provide that service with our help. We provide them the van, the training, we maintain that van so they can do that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for making the trip out, and hopefully we'll see you at home.
Thank you.
Back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Mann.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for having this hearing, to really zone in on the needs of our rural communities. So I represent the 1st District of Kansas, which is 60 counties in the mostly central and western part of the state. I'm from a rural community. My hometown, 800 people. My driver's ed coach was also my basketball coach, which if you're from a rural community, you understand that. And he used to load us up when we drive 60 miles to the big city of Hayes because there are stoplights in Hayes and there's no stoplight in our county as we were learning how to drive. Our family has a farm and a feed yard, and I remember that my dad and brother still operate, but middle of the night, cattle truck rolls in, you unload them. Those cattle may have been on the road from Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, Florida. Incredibly important, and repeatedly, the driver's number one priority was safety and also caring for those animals, and then they would put their own needs last because that's just the makeup of that industry. And Mr. Vanderwall, a handful of questions for you, and this continues to come up, this errors of service operation or exemption, and it keeps coming up this morning because it is so incredibly important to the industry. So would you just further expand upon the importance of the exemption, but also possible ramifications, or what are the effects if we do not continue this exemption in the future?
Well, thank you for that question. It all comes down to flexibility, again, like I said before. I'll use the example of loading cattle in Montana. That can vary by a couple of hours. And if it's so important, especially in hot times when you're hauling livestock, you have to keep moving to make sure that the air moves through the trailer to keep livestock cool. And they can't just be sitting along the edge of the road. So, like I said earlier, that may limit a person's ability to sell where he wants to sell, or it could just be a situation where we're not treating the livestock right, and that's not what we're after at all. It's, first is safety of the people driving the truck and the vehicles around it, but also animal welfare.
That's exactly right. What could Congress do to improve upon the exemption, and should we consider codifying it or making it permanent? We forget, we have to make an exemption every year. I would be for just making this flexibility permanent, but what are your thoughts on that issue?
Well, first of all, we very much appreciate the exemption because it has solved some problems and given us flexibility. But it would be nice to have it permanent because we always have to have our antennas up to make sure we are out there advocating to get that renewed again.
Yeah, and it just provides more uncertainty to an industry that is plagued with uncertainty, given market conditions and all the travails of trying to raise and care for, feed, and eventually produce livestock to produce meat. Last question, how can Congress ensure that our rural infrastructure is prioritized at a time when it seems like many times the administration overlooks rural America? In your view, Mr. Vander Waal, what is administration and what ought we be doing to focus more on the rural communities all across our country from a transportation standpoint?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it really comes down to recognize the importance of rural America in producing our food for our country and for the world, and also energy and fiber. I always say when I give a speech, food security is national security. And as long as we can feed ourselves, no matter what happens around the world, we'll be okay. But if we get to the point where we have to depend on other countries for our food supply, that's a serious problem.
I wholeheartedly agree. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for having this hearing. Thank you all for being here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Foshee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimonies. In my district, North Carolina's 4th, the Research Triangle Park is growing thanks to investments in world-class research centers and businesses big and small. But as it grows, the lack of affordable housing has pushed those who work in the Triangle to move farther and farther out into the more rural areas. That's why it has become more important for regional transportation to reach rural areas like those in Granville, Person, and Orange counties, for example. Mr. Morrow, how can we better mitigate traffic on the major local roadways to ease access for those who commute long distances daily?
Thank you very much for that question. Invest more in transit, because as Island Transit does, we have services that run from one of our islands into another county just for that exact reason. Every time you have more transit, more people can use it, and that takes cars off those roads. And in many cases, those commutes are pretty awful, I'm imagining, in your district. And it's a far better way to ride comfortably in a bus and not have to worry about that congestion. And you're benefiting all the other users of that highway as well, because you're actually increasing the carrying capacity of those roadways without spending millions of dollars to add more lanes, by instead putting people who choose to on buses. So it's a win-win for everybody. We have a great relationship with our State Department of Transportation in Washington State. They very much support the work of transit because they know the more that people use transit, it increases the capacity of those facilities and lessens the burden on them to expand and increase them at even higher rates. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I also have a concern about the difficulties that small rural municipalities face in applying for grant funding, like a lack of time, staff, and experience. What resources or educational systems could a congressional office provide to these municipalities to better equip them to apply and compete for funding with larger cities? And this question goes to both Mr. Morrow and Mr. Colas.
The challenge for local small communities is real. You're having a community of a couple of hundred people, a couple of thousand people that don't have the staff or the financial resources to hire out for grant writers. And they're competing with, in some of these grants, communities that are hundreds of thousands of people. So it's really a David and Goliath situation. From a strategy standpoint, what could we do in a congressional office? Yes, I think it's about education, but some of these grants are so complex to write that education of some of our local officials who are salt of the earth people, but they just don't operate in that arena, might work in some cases, but more likely the better strategy is to actually provide some funding to hire grant writers so that those folks that do not have the resources to even buy a ticket to the ballpark can get a ticket to the ballpark. Absent doing that with these grants, and we've moved to a very grant-oriented system, you're just going to leave them out of the option to apply and obtain those grants.
So I was just going to add ditto, but also funding the various national programs that help create the capacity for people to learn how to write those grants. CTAA, for instance, has an annual conference where people can come and learn how to do that. But probably the most important thing that you and your office can directly do is just let the agencies know when these grant opportunities come, and that will really help them. In our case, at my agency, our grant writer also serves as the clerk of the board and my assistant. So we all wear lots of hats, and so any help that you and your staff can provide is always greatly wanted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Mr. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses being here today. Mr. Grediman, as you know, New York City is in the process of finalizing details related to the Central Business District tolling program, a first of its kind, incredibly destructive congestion pricing scheme that unfairly hurts New Jerseyans. Under the plan, this program will impose significant tolling costs on daily commuters and charge between $24 and $36 per bus to companies that regularly bring visitors into the city. This will most surely include charter bus routes for school field trips into New York City. Each year, hundreds of school field trips from my district in New Jersey travel to the city to visit various museums and landmarks. How do you think this congestion pricing plan will impact the price of a school field trip, and how will it affect ABA members operating these routes?
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Keene. When you think about the origin of the congestion pricing, it is to reduce congestion in the central business district. And whether that congestion is reduced by a private motor coach, private bus, or a publicly funded city bus, a government contracted commuter bus, the bus is inherently reducing congestion, whether it's private or public. The fact that private buses are having to pay the tax and public buses are not doesn't make sense. At the end of the day, it's not necessarily about reducing congestion. It feels more like a tax. And it does affect the school kids that are going to New York City to sightsee and spend money. It does affect the seniors that are going to see a play and spend money at a restaurant. And at the end of the day, to me, to the ABA, it appears more like it is just another tax that is only being applied to private operators, whether you're riding in a privately owned bus or a government-owned bus.
Mr. Grediman, I also understand that the MTA has announced plans to exempt personal vehicles of people who have disabilities from the congestion pricing scheme, as well as city-run paratransit vehicles, which is commendable. Given the role and capabilities of your members' buses, how could this impact people who have disabilities from areas like my district who might want to visit New York but may not want or be able to drive?
Yeah, I believe that it will positively affect these people. There's no reason why a private operator won't be able to transport someone with disabilities. Most of the private motor coaches are equipped with ADA lifts, which will accommodate that. But at the end of the day, it still boils down to why are certain exemptions out there for private versus government buses?
So the cost will go up.
The cost will go up. The cost will go up for the riders. The cost will go up for the bus companies, and And again, it's just another tax that it's not necessarily about reducing congestion, it seems to be a tax.
And then on a different issue, you've referenced in your testimony the difficulties the intercity bus operators have in accessing train stations and other local transit centers to drop off or pick up passengers. Can you expand on how these problems affect ABA members and specifically their passengers?
Yeah, absolutely. So when a private operator is not allowed to use a publicly funded transit center for pickups and drop-offs, it creates a bottleneck in the national transportation system as far as making meaningful connections for passengers. A lot of times, people that are riding intercity buses may not have the means to connect to the intercity bus carrier without going through a transit, without riding the bus, without riding a city bus to get to the intercity bus. If the intercity bus station, in some scenarios, is in a non-desirable or it's in an industrial area where there's poor access, it makes riding intercity buses less attractive and less convenient, and what it ends up doing is not allowing certain members of the traveling public to be able to get to the bus station to get to where they need to go.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. I filed some legislation back in January, the Stronger Communities Through Better Transit Act. It has 104 co-sponsors, and what it would do would be to create a grant program, $80 billion over 4 years, $20 billion a year to support operational costs as opposed to capital costs for transit in underserved and unserved urban and rural communities. And with respect to rural communities, it would increase the federal share for operating costs to 80%, which would be something very important to extend transit to rural communities, rural people living in rural communities. Is that legislation something that you gentlemen can support?
Well, Todd Morrow from Island Transit. We are part of a broader organization, CTAA, who can give you more information about that, of course. But what I can tell you from our agency perspective, investment in transit is good and important, so thank you for that. I can also say that when it comes to operational funding, it's critical that we know that that operational funding will continue. So it can't be a time-limited bill, because if that's the case, it's hard for a transit provider, whether a for-profit or nonprofit or a governmental agency, to plan. If you provide service and then the money runs out, you have to cut the service. And there's nothing more horrible in our world than having to reduce service. So for us, we would always want something to have promise of continued payment. We welcome any investment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Johnson, would private transit operators be eligible for these grants?
Well, I would think that contracts with public agencies to provide transit to underserved areas would be covered. I'd have to go back and check it. If it's not, it should be.
Absolutely, I agree, and it would be great, and I think that 80% level is an appropriate amount and would be great for both private and public entities.
Yeah, it doesn't take a great big bus to go into a small city or small community and pick up 2 or 3 people. It can be a van, ideally, or it could even be some other vehicle. But just a way of getting people in rural areas to the pharmacy, to the doctor's office, to school, to the community college, or to visit a sick relative. Those things are important to people who live in urban areas and people who live in rural areas. Mr. Coles, you have anything to say about it? And Mr. Vanderwall?
Well, thank you. I apologize, I don't know the details of the bill, but from a general standpoint, when there's a need in a rural community, which all of South Dakota is, it's usually appreciated. Having said that, we always have to watch out for what the strings that might be attached are. So, you know, I'm not sure what our policy would be on that, so I'll have to leave it with that. Thank you.
And no strings attached that I know of, just really offering service to unserved and underserved areas, both urban, suburban, and rural. Mr. Coles?
In our rural areas in our state, we use shared ride taxi as our focus for rural transit. So if those rural taxis could be supported in a way that increases the percent so that they're more viable operations and create more access, certainly that would be a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So, well, thank you all for your thoughts about it. This is an idea whose time has come, but unfortunately, mired in gridlock. We have 104 co-sponsors, but all of them are Democrats. But we need to work hard to try to make this bipartisan legislation. And to your point, Mr. Morrow, this is something this is an issue that is not going to be served in 4 years. We won't cure the problem or the challenge. This is a challenge that we will continue to have, and I appreciate that viewpoint. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Van Orden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Colas, in your written testimony, you mentioned that we've got approximately 19% of the population lives in rural areas, but about 68% of the nation's roads are in those areas. You mentioned the critical structural failure of our culvert in Farmington, which is the construction starts in August on that. About how many of these culverts, I know you can't pin it across the country, do you have an idea of how many of these the culvert, which is essentially a bridge less than 20 feet, there are in the state of Wisconsin?
The national number is not known, and because we don't know exactly where they are, you're doing estimates based on waterways and surveys, and there have been 3 estimates, one by our association, one by the Wisconsin County Highways Association, and one by the Wisconsin DOT, and everybody comes to a number right in that 20 to 25,000 range. So, and that's not culverts, that's from 6 feet to 20 feet. There would be a vastly higher number for anything under 6 feet as well.
Okay. It's going to cost about $400,000 to fix that culvert and to stick that. I mean, that's a lot of money when you're talking about Farmington. People don't understand. You know, they're responsible for maintaining all of their roads, and to apply essentially, what is it, 4 years worth of their budget about to fix a single culvert. I'm just not okay with that. In your testimony also, you mentioned that our rural communities, the definition is 200,000 for rural. Well, Eau Claire's got 69,737 people in it. That's the largest city in our district. La Crosse has got 51,380,000 people in it. And if you tell someone from Potosi in Grant County, it's a population of 647 and the second oldest brewery in the state of Wisconsin, by the way, or Richland Center that's got 5,114 people, or people from Adams Friendship, the village has got 639 people in there. You tell them that Eau Claire and La Crosse are rural, they're going to laugh you out of a cornfield. So I really appreciate the fact that Mr. Stauber, my great friend from Minnesota, who's sitting behind me, and Mr. Fenstead, also a member, well, he's from Iowa, but he's still a good guy. Don't hold that against him. I'm very proud that we introduced the Protecting Infrastructure Investment for Rural America Act, and that's going to lower that threshold to 20,000 folks for the definition of rural in relationship to these roads. Can you tell us what type of effect it would have, you think nationwide, being the former chairman of the national town in Wisconsin, what effect would that have?
We appreciate all the folks that are on that bill, appreciate your sponsoring that, as well as Mr. Starbers. The definition of 200,000, as you noted, it's not rural. And we have a rural surface transportation program now that has $2 billion allocated into it out of the IIJA. And you have communities of 200,000 that are competing with the smallest town in Wisconsin. If they had the resources to muster a grant application, they have 36 people. Those towns often have one person in charge of roads. In our state, 50 miles of road is the average roadway, so they're plowing all the roads. They're mowing 100 miles of roads because you got to mow the ditches on both sides. They're doing all the summer maintenance, and they just don't have the time or the expertise to write a grant application. Contrast that with even the city of Eau Claire. They have a public works director, an entire public works department, an engineer, and perhaps even have a grant writer. And if they don't, they have the resources to hire it out. By decreasing that to something that is really, truly rural, you're going to even the playing field so you don't have that David and Goliath situation and really open up the opportunities for smaller communities to access those grants.
And thank you for that. I've limited time here. I got to tell you what, man. I wanted to have a grant writer, and my staff and the House Ethics Committee said I could, and then I'll be in jail in 5 minutes after that. So we don't have a grant writer on our staff, but we do have a guy named John Spears who's responsible for talking to guys like you and getting these community-directed programs going. We can point you in the right direction. We just can't write it for you. And here's why. Washington, D.C. sends money to Madison. Madison sends money to Madison and to Milwaukee, and they forget about us. And we're not doing that anymore. So if you can get the word out again to all your folks, get your community-directed spending projects to my office ASAP. We're going to help shape those to make sure that we can get money directly to the small communities that require these funds because they can't afford it themselves. Because as we said, the vast majority of roads in the United States of America run through small towns and middle America, and we are feeding the world. So please, when you get done with this committee, let's go talk and make sure that you're on board. Thank you, Mr.
Appreciate
Chairman.
that.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Hoyle. I'm sorry, Mr. Stanton. You got in here just in time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the witnesses for joining us today. Transportation networks, they are essential for the movement of people and goods across my home state of Arizona. Many of the rural routes across Arizona are interconnected with interstate highways, and when an accident occurs on one of those interstates, these rural routes become the alternative route for traffic. Rural reliever routes need to be adequately maintained and serviced to handle the surge of traffic volume intended for multi-lane interstates, even for short periods of time. Moving traffic onto a reliever route instead of it sitting idle for an extended traffic is important, not only to the frustrated commuter, but also for the flow of goods from rural and urban areas, but also for safety. State Route 347 in Arizona is a 4-lane, non-divided rural highway with no streetlights and only stop signs at interchanges. This is just one example of rural roads across Arizona, and particularly on the Navajo Nation in Arizona that I've visited and I've driven on, that struggle to maintain a level of service that we could expect from other areas of the state. Mr. Coles, in your testimony, you talk about low-cost, common-sense safety measures like rumble strips that would be a game changer for rural and tribal communities. How can Congress be a better partner and work with our local and tribal communities to implement these types of safety measures?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, there are, as I said, rural roads, the ones you described, are a lot more dangerous. And there are a number of low-cost safety mechanisms. You mentioned the undivided highway. Dividing that, even with barriers down the middle, eliminates those head-on collisions. That is one of the potential strategies. Another strategy, the rumble strips. In the rural areas, we travel a lot longer distances. So there's a tendency to be distracted, a little sleepy. Rumble strips have been shown to wake you up when you hit them, get that attention going again. How can you be helpful? I think in 2 ways. First of all, you got to have the funding to do it. And I think we've increased funding in IIJA and the FAST Act to try to address some of these things. The key is to get it down to the local level. That's the challenge, is we haven't designed the federal system to think about the capillaries, as I called them. We've really developed the federal system to look at only the heart. But we can't have, well, it's not something I would hope we would allow for, to have this high safety concern, high death rate, and instead we would start to get some of that money down to those local levels.
I really appreciate that. You also mentioned in your testimony, rural roads are often tribal roads. And these roads must be maintained much better than we have in Arizona and across the United States of America. In Arizona, we are in the middle of a historic drought that is impacting many of the rural roads that run through our tribal communities. Many of these rural roads are dirt, so the drought can create sand dunes. When we finally do get rain, the water creates clay that acts like ice. This mud can trap vehicles, delaying travel, and keep families from attending work, school, doctor's appointments, etc. While rain can seem to be a minor inconvenience to those in urban areas, on rural travel roads, it can mean the difference between getting somewhere or being stuck at home. I've heard from one county that says that sometimes when mud is particularly bad, the only option is to try and place tumbleweeds under the tires to attempt to gain some traction. Our tribes and tribal governments are equal nation-to-nation partners. I know much of this maintenance falls on the Department of Interior under the Committee of Natural Resources, but I would ask my colleagues here today and the stakeholders on the stand to consider the needs of our tribal partners as we make important decisions on local, state, and federal level. Our tribes deserve safe roads that their families can enjoy and roads that can safely transport goods across our state. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Stauber.
Thank you, Chair Crawford, for holding this really important meeting, and to all of our witnesses who have really talked about what's really the heart of the issue is the rural communities and the rural voice in Washington, D.C. I want to commend my good friend, Representative Van Orden. He and Representative Tiffany, we work closely on these issues because we represent rural. I represent northeastern Minnesota, rural Minnesota. Rural Wisconsin, rural Minnesota, it's the same group of great people, same struggles, okay? I'm not gonna follow my notes because I'm passionate about this. That IIJA, Mr. Coles, that you talked about, 200,000 people or less, in Minnesota, it's just St. Paul and Minneapolis. So that means our small communities in northeastern Minnesota have to fight, Edina, Bloomington, Wayzata, Roseville, and such. It's the same in Wisconsin, and we've talked about that. My mother was born in Glidden, Wisconsin, in the town of Jacobs, Ashland County. How is Glidden, Wisconsin, and Ashland County, the town of Jacobs, supposed to fight with Milwaukee or Madison? It is not fair. That bridge over the Chippewa River in Glidden, when it needs to be fixed, it should be fixed because those people in the small town America deserve the respect and the appreciation of this town. And it's on both sides of the aisle. My rural colleagues on the Democrat side and my rural colleagues on the Republican side, we get it, and we're pushing in one voice to make it happen. Mr. Knowles, you bring up the talk about grants. You are exactly right. We have legislation to reduce the grant from 500 pages to 20 for our rural communities. Mr. Vanderwall, I agree with you. Sometimes people aren't taking these grants because there's so many strings attached by this town. They have no idea. They have no idea your struggles and your needs and wants, your desires, and what works in your community. And I think that in a healthy balance, my colleagues, my rural representatives on both sides of the aisle, we hear you, and we're working to change this. Now, it didn't get this way overnight, and I don't think it's going to go back to where we need, but I can tell you that the rural members that spoke today are one and the same on this issue. I mean, had the IIJA, I'm the only federal representative on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the state of Minnesota, or for the state of Minnesota. I had zero input on that. That just came and said, here it is. You can bet, had we had a look on that, we would have found that 200,000 or less would have been changed. And we have Representative Finstead and I, along with Representative Van Orden and Tiffany, we're signed on to that legislation to bring it down to 20,000, something reasonable. Because rural America, as my good friend in Arizona, Mr. Stanton just mentioned, it matters. It matters, and we have to look beyond, because I think the foundation of this country is the heartland, is our rural communities. We have to have a fair shot. We have to make it work with the folks you have in place. You know, Mr. Knowles, I served in small town government and county commission, so we're in the wheelhouse together on this. I hear what you're saying. When you have to have literally some of these major urban areas, they have the money to hire several grant writers. That's not right, because the rural America is neglected. So in my last 45 seconds here, I just want to share, just want to thank you all for your comments and spending your time and money coming here to help educate all of us and those members that represent the more urban areas to let them know of our concern. Everything that you talked about in regards to rural transportation and a rural America has hit home. You've been a home run today. And so this legislation and some of the changes that we need to do, you can bet we're going to fight with every fiber in our body, because we represent our constituents, our rural Minnesota and rural Wisconsin. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you. Mr. Vanderwall, the trucking is a critical mode of transportation for rural America. Heavy trucks carry 70% of the agricultural and food products in the United States. And we also know that these heavy truck trips begin and end on local, rural roads and bridges that don't receive direct federal support. Can you comment on the state of rural infrastructure as it relates to the efficient movement of goods? How important is it to America's agriculture sector that local roads and bridges networks are in the state of good repair?
Well, thank you for that question. Our local roads are hugely important to us. And we've found that just in the last few years now, they're starting to deteriorate, and the local governments are really struggling to keep up because of inflation, higher costs, higher contractor costs, and all those things. And if you think about it, every road we have is crucial, even a township road that has gravel on it. In South Dakota, there's a tremendous number of those. But to the people that farm beside those roads, they're hugely important, because that's how they get their products to market. So we struggle a bit in South Dakota in particular with those local and township roads, getting to the state roads, but it's all part of the system that we're dealing with, and it's hugely important.
Thank you. Having served in local government, I've represented urban and rural communities, so thank you very much for that. Mr. Coles, much of America, including many communities in my home state of California, are rural and face capacity constraints. From your perspective, have you experienced financial and personal capacity limits? If so, how do these limits impact your ability to meet your local infrastructure goals and responsibilities?
Certainly, there are capacity issues in our small rural communities. Personnel is lacking. We squeeze blood out of a turnip from a budget standpoint. So the staff has everything they can do to take care of the roads, let alone think about how do we improve safety, how do we get a grant, et cetera. Because you can't often afford personnel to be able to do that, then you can't afford to write a grant writer. In addition to not being able to afford a grant writer, we have a number of areas of the country where grant writers just aren't available. If you're a private sector grant writer, you're not going to exist in an area that has a low density population. So even if you were blessed with the money to try to purchase a grant writer, they're not available. That lack of access creates a real inequity between rural communities and urban communities.
Thank you. Mr. Morrow, a lot of folks in smaller communities feel like public transit access is simply out of reach. Can you share any rural transit best practices other stakeholders might benefit from?
Thank you for the question. Yes, the on-demand mode of service where you don't just run a bus or rely on buses to be constantly running, but respond when someone wants a trip is a cost-effective way to meet that demand. And actually, that's happening today across America in many of our rural communities and urban communities as well. And that seems to work well to help. The other piece of it is just all of us work together, including those of us who are here, but back in our communities and state, to try to have more funding, and if there isn't funding available, work for nonprofits or others so that they have the vehicles so that they can step in if the public transit agency can't do that work themselves. So there are other partnership opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Morrow, as a follow-up question, we know that 3.6 million people in the United States do not obtain medical care due to transportation issues. This includes lack of vehicle access, inadequate infrastructure, long distances to reach needed services, and transportation costs. In short, transportation issues can impact a person's ability to access health care and become a social detriment to their health. What are some of the policy recommendations we should consider to ensure equitable access to transportation for all communities?
Well, funding. That's what it comes down to in most cases. And in fact, a big part of our paratransit business, the work that we provide, is helping people get to dialysis, for instance, which is an important thing. So I would ask for consideration of more funding for those trips because they are the most expensive that we all do. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I kind of want to preface my questions. First of all, I'm in the trucking business, and so we use a lot of the interstates and the highways across this country every day. And Mr. Coles, I want to get right into this thing. Do y'all see commercial truck drivers on local roads?
Absolutely.
And I don't think I have to ask you what the impacts are on those local roads. And I think the reason is because they're using these driver apps or these Google Maps or whatever map app that they're using to get to their destination. Rural towns, do they have mass transit?
The only transit we have in rural towns is shared ride taxi in the state of Wisconsin. So we aren't, in our state, using bus service at all.
I've got over 20 counties. We don't have mass transit in any of them except for Athens, Georgia, for the University of Georgia. Mass transit in our rural towns are a mom with a boatload of kids taking them to the recreation department or wherever she may be taking them for the day. I'd like to ask just one more quick question. Would you prefer a bike pass or a bypass around small towns?
A bypass or a bypass?
Bypass or a bike path?
A bypass.
How about electric charging stations or maybe passing lanes on these rural highways?
Passing lanes.
Yes, sir, I would agree 100%. You know, there's a reason, Mr. Chairman, that you're seeing these commercial trucks on these local highways. It's because our interstates are jammed, packed, daily, all across the United States, and it's getting worse, forcing these commercial truckers to have to go off and try to use these local highways and these local towns to make their deliveries on time. And there's a reason for that, y'all. We got an administration and we've got a Department of Transportation that is focused on DEI initiatives that are focused more on electric vehicles and mass transit, this fantasy that they want to push across all of America. They don't even want a rural America, actually. They would much rather see us piled up in some metropolitan areas where they figure that you will actually be dependent on them. So that's why they keep pushing for more federal funding, that free money that they want to give you. Reason we're $34 trillion in debt. Actually, rural Americans thrive on being self-sufficient. They can provide for their families. They know how to get to the doctor, the grocery store, the pharmacy. We've done it ever since this country was created. And we'll continue to do it tomorrow. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Hoyle.
Thank you very much. My district, Oregon's 4th Congressional District, is a largely rural district that includes Oregon's South Coast and the Willamette and Umpqua Valleys. It's Willamette like damn it, so if anyone asks you. We have two major issues. The first is like most rural areas, we have an extreme backlog of infrastructure investments. For instance, in 2 of the 6 counties that I represent, Lane and Douglas County, each one of which is about the size of Connecticut, we have 700 bridges, the vast majority of which were built in the 1950s and 60s, that are in dire need of repair or replacement. We've also been relying on the Highway Trust Fund to fund these projects, which is facing insolvency because we're relying on a gas tax. We need to figure out how to deal with that as we move away from fossil fuel. That's a conversation for a different day, but an urgent and important one. The fact is the Highway Trust Fund is becoming insolvent. So I have 2 questions. One is, there are clear economic benefits we see from investing in rural roads and bridges. How can Congress help spur more investment in rural bridges, especially the off-system bridges, those owned by counties and cities? Because according to what I'm hearing from my rural counties, the federal cost-benefit analysis tends to prioritize higher traffic volumes, higher population densities, which disadvantages rural transportation projects and makes their needs less competitive. And again, we are feeding the world, we are feeding the country, what we grow, what we raise, what we catch, everyone else needs to eat, right? So the second major issue, so my question is, what benefits should we consider when discussing rural projects? I know there are grants, but as everyone has said, rural communities don't have giant grant writing, parts of everybody does everything in small communities. The second major issue is a lack of workforce, specifically in bus and truck drivers, which is exacerbated in rural communities as the job is more difficult, and we, again, have great need to move the food we grow, raise and catch. In your views, what are the main reasons why recruitment and retention of bus and truck drivers are so difficult? And what are your views on utilizing the apprenticeship programs to recruit, train, and retain bus and truck drivers? Because again, this is an issue. I'll start with Mr. Morrow, but I'll open it up in the 2.5 minutes we have left.
Thank you very much. I wish I had the answers to those questions about recruitment, because if we did, we would be implementing them. Obviously, pay is top of mind, and we work with, through a collective bargaining agreement to address that. Other benefits, retention, hiring bonuses, all of those sorts of things, referral bonuses, things like that. But also the benefits that we can offer, we try to share that, because in a governmental setting, we're fortunate to have some really strong benefits that support families as well as the employee, things like that. And then we try to reach out to the veterans community, others, to find good talent. It's difficult. I think it's difficult everywhere.
So I think the first part is also that we have difficulty recruiting CDL drivers everywhere, but in rural communities where they're driving bus and they're driving trucks, it's really difficult because the infrastructure is crumbling. So if they can pick riding in a city and sitting in traffic, they will do that, and we desperately need to get the investment. So how do we deal with the weight that's given to the urban, more populous areas? And how do we recruit and retain more people? Anybody?
Thank you for the question. I believe right now there is an issue with getting CDL drivers, getting an actual CDL. There's a waiting period, there's a 14-day waiting period after a driver actually takes and passes the written exams before they can come and do the driving test. And then oftentimes, due to limited availability of CDL testing, you can't get an appointment to do that for another 2 to 3 weeks. So all of a sudden you're looking at
I hate to interrupt, but it's short. But the key thing is we don't have the infrastructure. So dealing with how do rural communities compete against urban areas when we are feeding the country and the world? Mr. Knowles, you look like you want to say
I will be really brief because your time's about to expire. Formula funds are better than discretionary grants. In our state, our secretary chose to take almost all of the Bridge Formula Program funds that came in IJA and send it to off-system bridges. It has been a huge help. The other thing that you talked about, cost-benefit analysis, ADT is not necessarily the right metric because it doesn't measure type or weight.
Gentleman's time's expired. Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kind of following up on that thought here a little bit, I've been thinking about this grant writing situation here a little bit for a long time, but it's been a hot topic today, and Mr. Coles was speaking with Ms. Hoyle about that. And would you expand a little bit on what, I mean, if we could just, we're almost alone here now, we can talk. If we just eliminated the grant writer direct route of funds there, I mean, how do you think we could really aggressively move towards that? Because every small county, small town, small jurisdiction, they can't compete with somebody somewhere else that has great big grant writers and a big budget for all that. So talk a little about what would that look like if we could just wipe the slate and say, we're not in that process anymore.
So we're talking discretionary versus formula. We'd much prefer formula funds because it allows the state's discretion to distribute it in a much more flexible manner. A couple of things that we could do with regard to the surface transportation program, and we actually have some, an example of this. In the FAST Act, we allowed the states to use 15% of their lowest cohort. So STP is, Surface Transportation Fund, is distributed amongst cohorts. The two lowest cohorts, you could take 15% of that and get it down to local roads and minor collector roads. That's where the action is at. Those are the farm fields and the forest entrances and the quarry entrances. We could expand upon that in the surface transportation program by increasing that percentage. We can also have a scenario where you look at how those cohorts are distributed differently. Right now, it's based on population rather than lane miles.
Well, there's the thing, because in my home state of California, which probably shouldn't be an example, but we're so much getting run over by the needs of the very large cities. It's probably common to most states, but we struggle with trying to get at least something equitable in some fashion in our rural areas. Let me jump to Mr. Vanderwall, and I might come back to you, Mr. McColes. In a recent hearing, we talked a lot about at-grade crossings, railroad crossings, and the panel we had that day was big on pushing, the best crossing is an eliminated at-grade crossing, and have all split grade, So, but the price of them we got out of that hearing was at least $40 million typically to build a split grade crossing where you had an at-grade before. And probably in my home state, it's double that because everything has to be so freaking expensive in California. So, $40 to $80 million it could be. So talking from a rural aspect, especially from a farmer, as a fellow farmer here, if they are really aggressive on eliminating at-grade crossings, what's that going to look like for agriculture, for movement of, raw materials and finished field products and tractors and all that stuff?
Well, thank you for that question. If I'm understanding your question right, I'm having a hard time hearing over the echo some, but when you talk about split rig crossing, you mean the overpasses with interstates, that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, I mean, even in a small town, like I picture a town I have in my district called Los Molinos there, which is basically, one main crossing in town. If they said, you got to come up with $40 million to have a split grade,
okay,
they're not going to find that kind of money. And so, and then all down the line where you have driveways, you have homes, you have small farms that have them even, with no lights on them. How are we going to go about, if they're going to be this aggressive on shutting them down just to shut them down, what's that going to do to our sector here?
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. That would be a major problem because there's so many of these rural areas, we don't even have a road every mile in some cases. And if a person has to drive, let's say 5 miles around an interchange like that might disappear, that's a huge economic imposition. Some areas have put in rotaries. They don't understand semi-trucks have to go around those, and they make them too tight. And there's all kinds of issues like that, that people from Washington don't understand how it really works in the local areas.
Well, we're seeing prime examples of that in California with this high-cost rail system, high-speed rail system they're putting through the valley that is just cutting off vast areas. And you're seeing farmers like, I got a tractor pulling a folded-up disc or a combine with a wide header on it, and I got to go 5 miles up this way, and, whereas you could just jump across at these other crossings, and that's a real impact. It's probably even a safety one. They talk safety all the time, but having to go so much farther with all this equipment. So I wish I had time to throw it to Mr. Coles what he deals with, but maybe in a different comment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Duarte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panel. Good to have you here today. Mr. Vanderwall, long-term Farm Bureau member, board member for 10 years in my local Farm Bureau. We've got an administration that's administering the Tax Cut and Jobs Act funds to a great extent out of a White House office, not through formulas, not through DOT grants solely, but literally has a White House office to hand this out, and in my opinion, politicize the awards. In California, I'm from a rural county in California, we also have a very blue state government, and that doesn't bode well for red rural counties in terms of getting our share. The Tax Cut and Infrastructure Jobs Act awards, grants that we just saw a few months ago, put $3.1 billion in my district for high-speed rail, which Congressman LaMalfa just touched on, and very little to actual highways that anyone's going to use, any resources the next 20 years. We look at the electrification, we look at how this Transportation Infrastructure Jobs Act money is being spent. We look at rural communities that produce most of our food here in America, that solve most of our logistics challenges and get that food to market. Net, in your opinion, and from your experience, is this administration enhancing food security with these trillions of dollars in investment, or are we moving backwards in food security for the United States?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it comes down to priorities. And when you talk about the high-speed rail line, obviously we can't haul anything on that in regard to ag products. We certainly need to keep priorities in line and remember that the local areas are really best suited to determine what their needs are. And so, a grant program that's out there, if it comes down with a whole bunch of regulations and requirements and things, that's not very productive. We need to let the local areas have the autonomy to identify their own needs. And if we can then use that money for the productive use that it needs to be used for in local areas, then that's the way to do it.
Yeah. Let's go to the grant writing. That's been a topic. And a few weeks ago, we had a person, Stacy Mortensen, from the Altamont Commuter Expressway, which is an Amtrak enhancement that will move people from Modesto and Stockton and Merced to the Bay Area for the job market in the Bay Area. It's a big deal. It's a project I do support as opposed to high-speed rail, which I think is a endless $204 million a mile boondoggle. The Altamont Commuter Express does hold out hope for being practical. When you take the Infrastructure Jobs Act money and apply for grants, you've got to review a Made in America constituent to it. You've got to have a carbon-friendly constituent to the application process. You've got to have a DEI, social justice, constituent to the process. And much less than even knowing how to fill these out or what the standards are, we don't even yet have standards for these. Several years later into the Biden administration, with their own office to deal with this stuff, doesn't yet have clear standards to how these criterion can be met so that grants can be awarded. The money hasn't flown out to major urban areas, much less rural areas. Are we on any realistic path with the trillions of dollars in debt America's taken on to the Transportation Infrastructure Jobs Act to actually solve rural issues in transportation?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and I'm not sure I have a solid answer for it other than the fact that we are very much opposed to all these requirements being put on. When you have to meet certain tests when you go through this process, it just complicates the whole issue and makes it a lot harder for rural governments especially to qualify. We'd go back to what we're already doing, the biofuels that we're raising and reducing the carbon footprint already. And that's what this government wants us to do. We've got the solution right here. And we just need to promote that and maybe even carry it a little further and go toward the sustainable aviation fuels and things like that we can produce with our products.
Thank you. I'll open those questions and those themes up to the rest of the panel if there's other input.
We have to remember that milk comes from a farm, not from the grocery store. And so this is about proportion of the trillions of dollars that were invested. Proportionately, because of the way the federal system has been designed, getting it down to those local roads and those minor collectors, which are 75% of the entire system in rural America, it's just not going to happen. There are limited examples of getting it down to those local roads where the farmers and the loggers and the miners actually do the work.
Would any members of the panel agree that a formula system by county similar to COVID relief funds would be more effective than the grant system?
Quick answer.
Formula funds are always better.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you, Chair.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Burleson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vanderwall, as you well know, farming is one of the most difficult jobs or professions in the United States. And but to make matters difficult, farmers now have to wade through regulation after regulation, many of which are being made by people who were not elected. To me, it's a challenge. People talk about democracy being under threat. There's nothing that threatens democracy more than to have unelected people who represent no one making decisions that affect everyone. And so this includes initiatives and orders from this administration on climate change, which has hurt our farming and transportation sectors across the country. This includes the methane emission regulations, and then the fuel emission standards that are going to impact all of our vehicles. So my question is, do you think that the average farmer is more worried about climate change, or are they more worried about staying, keeping their business going?
Yeah, thank you, sir, for that question. There's no question that the average farmer is more focused on remaining profitable and staying in business. We're in a position right now, just starting a few months ago, where for corn and soybeans anyway, we're under cost of production. And it comes down to inflation. It comes down to all the costs that we've seen, fertilizer, crop production chemicals, all those things. And when we have more requirements put on us by the federal government, it just increases expenses. Labor is one really good example as well. The increased labor that comes along with the H-2A program that a lot of people are forced to use, in fruits and vegetables especially, just adds costs. And so certainly farmers are very insulted by the laser focus on climate change and what to do about it. And they're sitting here thinking, I'm just trying to hold my business together and hopefully my family will have a chance to run it someday.
Are you familiar with the new EPA proposed rule on meat processing facilities?
I need to ask more questions.
They basically have a new rule related to the waste that's produced and requiring treatment on site of water for these facilities. In response to that, what I find, Mr. Vanderwall, is that Congress ends up playing whack-a-mole with all the most of the laws that are filed are trying to address the executive orders that have been implemented by someone who was not elected. People that are basically trying to act as though they are the legislative branch. One of the bills in response that I've sponsored is called the Beef Act, which would reverse that EPA proposed rule on the meat processing facilities. And another one is this new requirement that cattle ranchers have to get a prescription for the antibiotics to keep sometimes their calves alive, which is why I sponsored, along with Representative Burkeen, the Stop Government Overreach in Ranching Act. These are just two of the most ridiculous new executive orders that are written by people that have no idea what it's like to be a farmer. Would you agree?
I do agree, and your example of the VFDs for using antibiotics is right on target. We resisted that back when they put it in place, and of course it did go into effect. It's a hassle, though, for a producer to have to call their vet, and typically the vet just writes up the prescription, or the VFD, veterinary feed directive, and you get it done. If there is a benefit to it, it deepens the relationship between producers and their veterinarians, but we think there would have been a more simple way to do it.
So, and how is the agriculture, the farming community impacted by the transportation, these new transportation regulations?
Well, anything that makes it more difficult and adds burdensome regulations is a very big concern to us. I think I've said before, with these grant programs or whatever the situation is, we need to let our local governments have more autonomy to respond to the local needs that are out there.
And not to step over you, but I've just a few seconds left, and I want to get your comment on, do you believe that the federal government could use its dollars more wisely? I know that, for example, we are spending $7.5 billion to fund electric vehicle charging stations that I think would not benefit rural Missouri whatsoever.
Well, I think you're correct in that, and consumers are telling us what their thoughts are about that through the lack of market for electric vehicles. People just aren't interested in buying them, and I think we need to find a happy medium someplace in there.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Mr. D'Esposito.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Grediman, thank you for being here. Thank you all for being here. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with what's going on back in New York, but we have a state legislature and a governor, all three Democrats, who have been, over the last few years, known for really their overreach. We had their attempt to eliminate local zoning so that they could build housing in communities. We have Governor Hochul has what's called the Rapid Act, which is proposed basically taking the local voice out of permitting processes for their green agenda. We've seen the disasters of criminal justice reform and cashless bail, where bureaucrats in Albany decided to give criminals more power than police officers and law enforcement, legitimately taking the handcuffs away from the police. And really handcuffing law enforcement from doing their jobs. And now there's another overreach coming. And for far too long in New York and the tri-state area, the MTA has really served as the MTA has become the ATM for the state. And what we're seeing is that they want to impose what's called congestion pricing. And they're selling it as a plan to have people increase ridership on the subways. But the fact is that people aren't riding the subways because they don't want to get either one, thrown in front of it, or two, stabbed or shot. It's not because they just want to drive, it's because they're too afraid to be in the subway. But nonetheless, they've decided once again for the people and the hardworking people that live in New York and on Long Island to serve as the ATM for the MTA. So we have a motor coach company that services Long Island from New York City, and they recently sent an email to its riders saying that the company will pay more than 30% per week in tolls if congestion pricing goes into effect. And you mentioned in your testimony that the bus companies are already struggling to remain viable post-pandemic, and operators are facing various strains on their operation, whether it's operators, whether it's the ability for the riders to utilize the buses. Can you talk about how adding costs and specifically this disaster and overreach of congestion pricing, how it would affect the American Bus Association members in the New York tri-state area?
Yes, absolutely, and thank you for the question. You know, it's going to affect the member bus companies very adversely. It's extra expense, it's extra costs that are really no more than a tax. You know, motor coaches, buses, they're already removing cars from the road. Each motor coach can remove up to 56 cars from the road, and so we're already doing our part to reduce congestion. If this is really about congestion mitigation,
Which it's not.
It sounds like it's, from what I know, it's more about the MTA budget shortfalls and how to fund that. And coming up with this plan penalizes private operators like Hampton Jitney and every other private bus operator in New Jersey and New York that does their part to bring people into the city that are spending money at the theaters, at the restaurants, doing sightseeing and whatnot, and all of a sudden, it's just another tax that private operators are forced to flip the bill.
And you know what? You said it best when you said it penalizes operators and it's just another tax. And when asked, when the MTA was asked and the governor was asked, well, what is this congestion pricing is about? Why do you need the money? Because like you said, it's not about reducing congestion. It's about, so they say, having people ride the subways and the buses, which they don't want to because they're scared. We've spoken to the transit workers union, the transportation workers union, who said they're even afraid for themselves on the trains. And one of the reasons as to why, and which shows that they're just doubling down and they really don't care about the American people, and in this case, New Yorkers, Long Islanders, and the tri-state areas, because they've lost so much money because of theft of service. Why? Because people have no reason to pay to be on the subway or be on the buses or to pay for the Long Island Railroad because there's no reason to. Because now you could just jump the turnstile, you can't get stopped, you're not going to get arrested or given a summons, so why pay? So they've created this disaster, and now they're passing it on to operators like you, and like you said, it is just another tax. And if you could monetize, just in your situation, what this could cost you per year if this goes into effect.
You know, I can't give you an estimate on that, but for the operators in New York, in New Jersey, it's in the millions of dollars.
Millions of dollars on local business owners who probably in the situation that you have described may not even be able to continue in business because they are already facing shortfalls. So now they're getting, like you said, another tax, an attack on local business with the sole purpose of filling budget shortfalls, not trying to reduce congestion, and certainly not increasing ridership on the subways because no one wants to ride them because they're too scared because of cashless bail and criminal justice reform that Democrats like Kathy Hochul implemented. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. And are there any further questions from any other members on the committee? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I'd like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony. The committee stands adjourned.